This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and former U.S. Marine Paul Whelan are among those now free from Russian custody. That's after a large-scale prisoner swap took place earlier today. NTD's Washington correspondent Jack Bradley has the latest on this story from the White House.
It's the largest prisoner swap between U.S. and Russia since the Cold War. 26 prisoners now being released. And the White House behind me here is flying the wrongful detainee flag right below the American flag, the first time that they're flying it in celebration. Now, among those released include 3 U.S. citizens and 1 green card holder, including Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich and former Marine Paul Whelan. Now, they're in the care of the U.S., and earlier at the White House, President Biden met with the families of the freed hostages and said that it's an incredible relief to have them home. Watch.
The deal that made this possible was a feat of diplomacy and friendship. Multiple countries helped get this done. They joined the difficult, complex negotiations at my request. So for anyone who questions whether allies matter, they do. They matter. And today is a powerful example of why it's vital to have friends in this world.
Now, it appears the prisoner swap won't have much of an impact on the Russia-Ukraine war, as when President Biden was asked on whether he would speak to Putin after this, he said that he doesn't have to. Now, Whelan was in prison for about 6 years, and he was convicted of espionage, and Gershkovich was sentenced to 16 years in Russia, being held for 1 year, and the State Department maintains that all of these freed U.S. prisoners were wrongfully imprisoned. Watch.
This is an issue that is so important and personal to Secretary Blinken. In the first weeks in this department, when he was sworn in as Secretary of State, he met with the families of all Americans wrongfully detained at that time in a video call, and continues to meet with families and returnees on a regular basis.
There are also 5 Germans and 7 political prisoners in Russia being released to the West. And in exchange for this, the West is releasing 8 prisoners to Russia, including spies and cybersecurity criminals. Among them is Vadim Krazikov, who was convicted of murder in Germany back in 2019, allegedly at the hands of Russian authorities. And President Biden and Vice President Harris are meeting with the freed hostages at the Joint Andrews Base in Maryland. Reporting from the White House, Jack Bradley, NTD News.
And Vice President Kamala Harris commented on the swap earlier today. She said, quote, "President Biden and I and our team have engaged in complex diplomatic negotiations to bring these wrongfully detained Americans home. We never stopped fighting for their release, and today, in spite of all of their suffering, it gives me great comfort to know that their horrible ordeal is finally over." Harris made those remarks after delivering a eulogy at a Houston church today to honor the legacy of longtime Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who recently died fighting cancer. Family, friends, and fellow politicians were at the gathering. NTD's Iris Tao has more from Houston.
Here at a North Houston church, high-profile dignitaries gathered to honor the life and legacy of late Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who died recently after announcing just a month ago that she had pancreatic cancer.
Vice President Kamala Harris delivering a eulogy calls her one of the smartest and toughest in Congress.
Sheila Jackson Lee worked with all her heart. She was also one of the most unrelenting. As those of us who were her colleagues can attest.
While Harris did not explicitly refer to her campaign, she used the opportunity to make a call.
Let us continue to fight to realize the promise of America, a promise of freedom, opportunity, and justice.
Former President Bill Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, and House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries were all here on Thursday.
What a legacy! May she forever rest in peace.
President Biden was also in Houston earlier this week to pay respects. The late Congresswoman served her district for over 30 years. During her career, she earned a reputation for advocating for human rights and social issues. We talked to some members of the community about what the late Congresswoman meant to locals.
She's been a strong supporter not only of her community, of the people, but also of women. Any event that we had, she was there to support.
She's my good friend for over 40 years. During Hurricane Harvey, when Houston was underwater, she made sure everyone was taking place. She was out there in the trucks, in the boats. She was everywhere.
Meanwhile, in campaign news, the Democratic National Committee started a days-long process to virtually nominate Harris for president. That means she will become the nominee weeks before the Democratic National Convention.
And Harris's campaign announced that next week she will be campaigning with her to-be-announced running mate across battleground states. Reporting from Houston, Texas, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Republican vice presidential nominee J.D. Vance visited a stretch of the southern border in Arizona. Here he is speaking earlier today.
You cannot have an effective border policy unless you have somebody who is coordinating all the different agencies of the U.S. federal government. You need the State Department involved to send people back to their home countries. You need the Department of Justice involved to prosecute these terrible drug crimes. And of course, you need DHS involved so that the Border Patrol is empowered to do their job. It's just unbelievable. It is unbelievable what we're letting happen at this southern border, and we're letting it happen because Kamala Harris refuses to do her job.
Speaking of his own experience as a child with a mother addicted to drugs, Vance highlighted the dangers of having fentanyl and other drugs smuggled across the border. And he pointed to instances of human trafficking to highlight the dangers of unregulated border crossings. Vance also said migrants need to be kept at the border while their cases are processed and that catch and release needs to stop. Trump's running mate said there needs to be what he called common sense policies to protect the U.S. and its citizens. And the Trump campaign announced today it raised more than $138 million in July, providing a cash on hand balance of $327 million at the end of the month. And a New York State appeals court today rejected Trump's challenge to a gag order in his New York criminal case. This means that Trump cannot comment publicly about individual prosecutors and others in the case until Justice Juan Merchan sentences him on September 18th. The judge imposed the gag order a few weeks before the trial began on April 22nd, saying Trump's comments could derail the proceedings. Trump's lawyers have argued that the gag order violated his constitutional free speech rights under the First Amendment. It has now been 300 days since the October 7th massacre in Israel. And with the recent killing of a Hamas leader in Iran, tensions in the Middle East are especially high. NTD's Jason Perry brings us an update.
Crowds gathered in the capital of Iran on Thursday to mourn the death of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh. He was killed on Wednesday morning in Tehran. Israel has not claimed responsibility for his death, but Iran evidently wants to hold Israel responsible. On Thursday, Iran's parliament speaker spoke at Haniyeh's funeral and said there is a duty to respond at the proper time and place. Israel is also facing threats from Lebanon, where Israel reportedly killed Hezbollah's senior commander. And the leader of Hezbollah warned that conflict with Israel had entered a new phase, and it's now an open battle on all fronts, including Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. Meanwhile, in Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made the following statement.
Israel is highly prepared for any scenario, both defensively and offensively. We will exact a very heavy price for any act of aggression against us from any arena.
This comes as Israel confirmed the death of Hamas military leader Mohammed Deif. Israel said he was responsible for planning the October 7th massacre, in which 1,200 people were killed and 251 hostages were taken into Gaza. It's now been 300 days since that tragic day, and families of hostages are still calling for their loved ones to be released from Hamas captivity. And in the Gaza Strip, some displaced Palestinians appear to be losing hope.
There is no life left for the people of Gaza in general. After 300 days of war, we do not see that there is an end to the war. The way we see it, that there is no end to the war.
Also on Thursday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken said a ceasefire in the Middle East is, quote, not only achievable, it has to be achieved. Jason Perry, NTD News.
President Biden spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by phone earlier today. Biden, quote, reaffirmed his commitment to Israel's security against all threats from Iran, including its proxy terrorist groups Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. This is according to a readout of the call. Biden discussed efforts to include new U.S. military deployments to support Israel's defense against threats. Vice President Harris also joined the call. And earlier today, Hezbollah launched a barrage of rockets toward Israel. This is the first attack by Hezbollah in the last 48 hours. Following sirens that sounded at close to 10 p.m. local time in the Western Galilee region, numerous projectiles crossed from Lebanon into Israeli territory, some of which were intercepted, and the rest fell in open areas. No injuries were reported. Shortly after the launches, the Israeli Air Force struck the Hezbollah launcher located in Lebanon. Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, is asking the U.S. to restart talks and lift oil sanctions. But the U.S. is still scrutinizing the socialist leader. NTD's international correspondent Ariane Pastar has the update from Brazil, starting with Maduro's dispute with Elon Musk.
Venezuela's socialist leader Nicolas Maduro this week challenged American businessman Elon Musk to a fist fight. Musk then took to X, responding, "I accept." Maduro now responded to the confirmation from Musk.
Elon Musk, let's fight. Come here, you and I.
Meanwhile, in Venezuela on Thursday, Brazil had to take over the embassies of Argentina and Peru. That's after Maduro expelled the diplomats of those countries because they don't recognize the election results. Maduro now wants to restart dialogue with the US based on an agreement mediated by Qatar. The agreement lost its strength after the US reimposed oil sanctions on Venezuela.
If the US government is willing to respect Venezuela's sovereignty and stop threatening Venezuela, we can resume the dialogue.
But the US is still waiting for Maduro to release the tabulated voting results to verify who won the election. The State Department on Thursday responded to a question from NTD.
Venezuelan opposition and civil society provided decisive evidence showing that Edmundo Gonzalez received a majority of the votes in this election. It's been 4 days since this election happened. Any polling station data or results the CNE releases now would require close scrutiny.
The US is now consulting with international partners to discuss the next steps. Sanctioning Venezuela is one of the options the government has not ruled out. Reporting in Brazil, Ariane Pastar, NTD News.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer condemned violent protests in England that followed the killing of 3 young girls in a knife attack. He's vowing tougher consequences for rioters and measures such as wider facial recognition deployment to stop the rioters from boarding trains. NTD's Malcolm Hudson has more for us from London.
Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has said action will be taken following violent disruption in parts of England. It comes after 2 nights of protests triggered by the killing of 3 young girls in a knife attack at a Taylor Swift-themed dance holiday club.
We will establish a national capability across police forces to tackle violent disorder.
Starmer discussed with police chiefs how to tackle violent protesters. He said the policing response must have shared intelligence, a wider deployment of facial recognition technology and criminal behaviour orders.
To restrict their movements before they could even board a train.
Disorder broke out across parts of Britain following the knife attack. The riots were in part fueled by false claims the suspect was a radical Muslim illegal immigrant, and in part due to long-running discontent over policing standards and immigration policies. Some protesters in London hurled beer cans and flares near the Prime Minister's Downing Street residence Wednesday evening. London police said 111 people were arrested for offences. In the town of Hartlepool in northeastern England, rioters set a police car alight and threw glass bottles and eggs at officers. The knife attack suspect has now been named as 17-year-old Axel Rudakubana. He was born in Britain to random parents and appeared in court earlier Thursday. Rudakubana is charged with 3 counts of murder and 10 counts of attempted murder. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The recent killings of Hamas and Hezbollah terrorist leaders have sparked growing concerns of possible escalation in the Middle East. Earlier, we spoke with Justin Logan, Director of Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, about the likelihood of U.S. involvement in a broader regional conflict. Justin Logan, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thank you.
Now, Iran and its proxies are all vowing revenge after recent killings of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. How do you view the deaths of these top commanders? Will it lead to escalation or de-escalation?
I think the Hamas example is interesting because, of course, talking while fighting is always difficult, right? The United States has done it, all states do it. But it's very difficult to be negotiating with a party with which you're actively in conflict. And Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas commander and lead diplomat, really, was at the forefront of the negotiations to produce a ceasefire with Israel. So I think when the negotiator himself winds up being killed, that makes the prospect of some sort of diplomatic breakthrough even more remote. Right, you could imagine people saying, well, why would I want to become the next negotiator when the last one got himself blown up while he was in Tehran? And so on the Hamas piece, I think it is inauspicious for the idea of any kind of diplomatic breakthrough that would produce a ceasefire. When it comes to Hezbollah, I think there's even more reason for concern. There's a real escalatory potential. The Iranians have said that they have loosed the Iranian military to respond directly on behalf of Iran. Of course, the Hamas leader was killed while he was in Tehran. But the Hezbollah front, which is more closely aligned with Iran, has been simmering along since the conflict began. And I worry a lot that there is escalatory potential, not just for Lebanese people and for Israelis, but for Americans there as well.
Now, back in April, we did see Iran fire drones and missiles at Israel, but most of those were intercepted or missed. What can we expect to see from Iran this time?
So I think the question is how much the response puts into the air, really. I mean, the April issue, the Iranians telegraphed it from a long way off. They signaled to Arab regimes in the Middle East that they knew would talk to the Americans, that it was coming. The Americans, the French, and others who assisted the Israelis in intercepting these strikes had the ability to get ready, whereas I think that the prospect of the response here could be much more unpredictable and much bigger. I mean, one thing that we haven't seen over the course of this conflict has been Israeli casualties in Israeli cities, and I'm afraid that could be coming here any day now.
And if this does escalate into a broader regional conflict, how likely is the U.S. to get involved?
Well, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said several weeks ago that when it comes to the so-called Northern Front between Israel and Lebanon, two factors were important to bring into the discussion. One is that the United States could not provide the extent of coverage in supporting Israel's defense as it has so far with the conflict with Hamas. Hezbollah is too well armed. It has too many rockets and missiles. And so there would sort of invariably be those Israeli casualties that I mentioned previously. And the second point, which is particularly notable for Americans, was that there was a very good prospect that the United States could get sucked into the conflict. We have troops that are profoundly exposed and vulnerable in places like Syria and Iraq, places where Iran has a tremendous amount of influence. And in a meaningful way, and I say this with great discomfort, they're sitting ducks. They're indefensible. And so I think that's a real problem for us as Americans to say, you know, there's every reason to believe that they will become targets in this scenario. And if we decide we want to get into a war with Hezbollah, we should do it with our eyes wide open and not back into it when a very predictable escalatory spiral is unfolding before our eyes.
On that note, is it in the United States' best interest to get involved? What would that look like?
No, I think that the recent history of U.S. involvement in conflicts in the Middle East is not a happy one. Of course, the Afghanistan war went on for 20 years, and we wound up losing to the Taliban. We invaded Iraq under some cooked-up pretenses and had a very costly, very ruinous conflict there. The conflict against ISIS went somewhat better, although we were sort of pushing on a political open door because ISIS was so repellent to many people in the neighborhood that they decided, however they felt about the Americans, they liked them better than they liked ISIS. But I think the idea of us getting into a conflict with Hezbollah would be very bad for American interests at a time when the United States is, over a decade into its supposed pivot to Asia. This would really bog the United States down in a protracted conflict in the Middle East at a time when the Gaza situation has not really been put to rest, right? If you think about it, we have no insight into what the plan is for the political denouement of this conflict, who is going to rule in Gaza. The place is completely destroyed. It's in ruins, so somebody's going to be trying to rebuild down there. And the idea that you would open up a second front in a conventional sense in this conflict without having answered the most basic questions about the previous front in the conflict strikes me as very risky from an American point of view.
Justin Logan, thank you so much for your time.
It's my pleasure.
Harvesting another human being's internal organs for a profit, an atrocity that's been happening in China under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party. This crime in large part directly targeting religious believers. Lawmakers on Capitol Hill are working on a policy to punish CCP officials who engage in the crime. NTD's Melina Weiskup has the story.
Senator Marco Rubio has introduced 3 bills countering the Chinese Communist Party, stating Communist China has been able to get away with a campaign of widespread evil. One of the bills is the Falun Gong Protection Act, to create a U.S. policy to sanction CCP officials who have knowingly and directly engaged in or facilitated the involuntary harvesting of organs. A crime which Falun Gong practitioners are reported to be one and probably the main source of organ supply. One Falun Gong practitioner previously told NTD her father was one of those victims.
And the incision was all the way down, which clearly indicated that my father's organ had been harvested, likely while he was still alive.
So there's a ready supply of organs of any kind, of any type, what have you, because they're taking them from living people. I mean, it's the most horrific thing you can imagine.
The State Department recently told NTD that the Chinese regime should, quote, cease its depraved actions against prisoners of conscience.
Electrical batons to beat me. I lost my consciousness.
This persecution has been going on for 25 years, and several resolutions condemning the CCP's persecution and organ harvesting of Falun Gong practitioners have passed the House, but they've all stalled in the Senate. So far, Senator Rubio's bill has 3 co-sponsors, and it passed the House in June with full support.
This has to be a national and a global movement to raise awareness and then to take action to hold the CCP accountable. And every human around the world needs to see this and open their eyes.
Hope should be alive. Hope needs to be alive. It's not happening fast enough.
Now it's up to Senate Leader Chuck Schumer to bring this bill up for a vote in the Senate. He could bring it up as a standalone bill or perhaps attach it to a broader piece of legislation, say the annual National Defense Bill. If it does pass the Senate and is signed into law by President Biden, it would be the first federal law to counter the Chinese Communist Party's decades-long persecution against Falun Gong, as well as counter the regime's illicit organ trade. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
Firefighters are working hard to contain wildfires raging across Colorado's Front Range and in Northern California. The fire in Colorado has killed 1 person. NTD's Christina Corona has the latest updates on the blazes.
The Alexander Mountain Fire, burning near Loveland in northern Colorado since Monday, has grown to 7,648 acres. According to the U.S. Forest Service, the fire is 1% contained as of Thursday morning. Several road closures and mandatory evacuations are in place as crews continue to battle the blaze. Despite the hot, dry, and windy weather forecasted for the area on Thursday and Friday, the U.S. Forest Service mentioned a slight chance of scattered rain over the weekend in its Wednesday evening update. As of Thursday morning, the cause of the fire has not yet been determined. In Northern California, the Park Fire has burned 391,200 acres and is 18% contained as of Thursday morning. It's now the 5th largest fire in California history. First responder therapy dogs have been brought in to boost the spirits of firefighters battling the park fire. Local authorities said the 3 therapy dogs recently arrived at a base camp in Butte County. CAL FIRE shared videos and images on X. "We are here to help the humans with their mental health while assigned to the incident and away from their other humans and fur friends." The park fire is one of more than 100 large active wildfires currently burning across the United States. Christina Corona, NTD News.
And joining me now to discuss the historic prisoner swap with Russia is Gerard Filitti. He's senior counsel at the Lawfare Project and an attorney specializing in international law. Gerard, thank you so much for joining us. Great to see you again. Now, to begin, this is being called the biggest prisoner exchange between Russia and the West since the Cold War. President Biden said, quote, "There is nothing that matters more to me than protecting Americans at home and abroad," and that deals like this one came with tough calls. What do you make of this exchange? Was it a fair one?
It's definitely a tough call to make when you have a state like Russia that intentionally takes Americans prisoner, effectively violating their legal rights, their human rights, in order to facilitate these types of exchanges. This is not something that was an honest arrest or a conviction. This was politically motivated from the beginning. So it's difficult to make a call when a country like Russia holds your citizens hostage to exchange for the release of terrorists and murderers that are imprisoned in the West. Definitely not an easy call. However, we do have a policy in America. We do want our citizens returned to us, especially when they're being held unfairly, especially when they're being held illegally. So I think President Biden did make a difficult but correct call to get our people back.
And what do you make of the timing of this deal?
The timing is interesting. I think that the fact that Gerkovich was basically rushed to trial suggests that this was something that was being planned or being discussed in advance, that there was knowledge by the U.S. government potentially that this was a deal on the table. Because bear in mind, we also had to talk to Germany about releasing some Russian prisoners incarcerated in its system, and that takes time and diplomatic efforts as well. So the timing strikes me as something that's been in the works for a while, but we only became aware of it last night.
To your point, Turkey mediated the swap and several countries were involved behind the scenes, including the U.S., Russia, Belarus, and Germany. Now, how do negotiations like this work?
It's not easy because it requires having multiple negotiators dealing with the different parties. So essentially, you have to have explanations given to the State Department, essentially, and then get buy-in from the foreign government that this is an exchange that's in their interests to facilitate. In this case, it was easier to do because Germany, for example, had its own citizens in Russia that were being held detained illegally. So it was in their interest as well to facilitate the release of their citizens. But it's a diplomatic dance to get everyone to cooperate, and Turkey played a very important role because it is both a NATO ally, a NATO member state, so it is disposed to help America, but it is also on good terms and close with President Vladimir Putin. So it played a difficult role, but an important one.
And expanding on that, how does international law play into this? How complicated is it to achieve a swap like this, especially one of this scale?
It's not the international law that's really the issue here, but it's the national law of each state. Because when you have someone who is incarcerated in Germany, for example, you need that person to be released under German law. So that needs expertise by the German government in understanding what they need to do to effect that release. Same with Belarus, same with the United States, same with Russia, although Russia is more of a dictatorship than anything else when it comes to their justice system these days. So it really requires being able to comply with domestic law in multiple countries in order to facilitate this.
And what's next in terms of the relations between the West and Russia? Are we any closer to a ceasefire in the Russia-Ukraine war?
I don't think this will impact any prospect for a ceasefire in Russia-Ukraine, and I don't think this does anything to help relations. I think this highlights the issues that the West has with Russia, namely that they are behaving like a rogue state that takes Westerners prisoners in order to achieve its political objectives. If anything, this may lead to more deteriorating relationships with Russia. As far as Ukraine, we also need to consider that some of the people who were exchanged, the Russians who were released, include cyber criminals and money launderers, the exact type of people who are being used to finance Russia's war in Ukraine. This may actually speak to Russia's level of desperation to continue fighting, that they're looking to release prisoners or terrorists who are expert in money laundering and cyber warfare.
Gerard Filitti, Senior Counsel at the Lawfare Project and attorney specializing in international law. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.
In the last day of session before summer recess, the Democrat-controlled Senate fails to pass a bill that would have expanded the tax credit for families with more than one child. NTD's Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more on this story.
The Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act failed to pass on the Senate floor, even though it had already been approved by the Republican-controlled House of Representatives with overwhelming bipartisan support. Senate Democrats called the legislation a no-brainer.
The vast majority of Republicans blocked a hugely bipartisan package that would have helped families, would have helped businesses, would have helped housing, and helped communities hit by natural disasters. Something the American people wanted. Rare is the moment that the Senate Republicans are even to the right of the House Republicans, but it happened today.
Republicans, on the other hand, called the bill a show vote and questioned why Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer took over 6 months to put the bill on the Senate floor for a vote.
Colleagues on this side of the aisle have serious unresolved concerns. More than 90% of the supposed benefits of the bill, as written, come as a $30 billion expansion of cash welfare instead of relief for working taxpayers.
According to the Congressional Budget Office, the tax credit expansion would have cost the federal government $33 billion, and not all Republicans opposed it.
We should be in favor of helping people who want to have families have families. One of the reasons it's hard to have a family in America today is it's really expensive. That's what we ought to be talking about. And I think our message ought to be for folks who want to have families. A lot of Americans do. A lot of Americans have one kid, they want to have two, but it's like, well, we don't know how to do it, we can't afford it.
The legislative impasse will likely make taxes a hot election topic for congressional hopefuls this coming November. It's important to note that the Senate went on its August recess this Thursday without approving a single appropriation bill to fund government through fiscal year 2025. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, plenty to discuss in the Olympics, so let's start right there as gymnast Simone Biles won gold in the women's all-around event. Where does this latest triumph put her?
I mean, right up there with the best. I mean, this is her second career gold in the women's all-around. Only 2 others have done that. And at age 27, she's the oldest in like more than 70 years to do so. And that's now 6 Olympic golds for her, 9 medals overall, tying her with the great Nadia Comaneci. Now, unlike the team competition win Tuesday, this one was actually in doubt for a while. She misjudged a transition on the uneven bars, nearly fell. It cost her some points, but she made up for it on the balance beam and then clinched it on her signature routine, the floor exercise. So it was a narrow victory, but more redemption for her after withdrawing from the Tokyo Games to focus on her mental health. Now she'll compete in 3 more events coming up, so maybe some more golds could be had too. And it should be noted that Biles' teammate Suni Lee, who won this event 3 years ago at the Tokyo Games, had a great all-around too. She ended up with bronze. It was a big day again for U.S. women's gymnastics.
Biles' win did seem to be part of a big day for Team USA. What other wins did we have?
Yeah, they had 4 gold wins today. They only had 5 on the first 5 days. This is kind of a big day for the U.S. In addition to Biles, they got one in men's rowing. This is in the men's 4 event. This is a 2,000-meter event. They got another gold in fencing as the women won the team gold. Then in swimming, another big day. Kate Douglas won a thrilling gold in the women's 200-meter breaststroke, very tight race. Meanwhile, Reagan Smith picked up silver in the 200-meter butterfly. And finally, Katie Ledecky was part of the women's 4x200-meter freestyle freestyle that won silver, finishing second to Australia. Now for Ledecky, that's Olympic gold number 13. She's now the most decorated American woman in Olympic history. She does have one more event still. That's the 800-meter freestyle. If she wins gold there, that will be her 9th, and that would tie her for the most in Olympic history by a woman, regardless of country. So big chance for her again. That's going to be on Saturday.
Now, an unusual Olympic scene this morning as a female boxer withdrew from a match less than a minute into the fight. What happened there?
Yeah, Italy's Angela Carini was hit in the face early in the match by Algeria's Imani Khalif. She then kind of called timeout, retreated to her corner, and slammed her headgear onto the canvas as her trainer signaled it was over. Now, afterwards, she was in tears saying how unjust this was. Now, in an interview later, she said she'd never been hit so hard in her life. Now, it should be noted that last year at the Women's World Championships, Khalif, who hit her, was one of 2 boxers who were stripped of their medals for what they said were elevated levels of testosterone. But the International Olympic Committee actually came out with a statement today that said that disqualification was done without any due process, while calling those 2 victims and pointing out that they competed in the Tokyo Olympics 3 years ago. Now, the IOC said both boxers met the criteria to compete at these games, although they didn't specify what criteria that was. Now, a lot of people have sort of jumped to the conclusion that this is another transgender athlete in women's sports. I don't think that's the case. There are some rare cases of women with naturally higher levels of testosterone. Maybe this could be it, but it's certainly going to be a developing story here at the Olympics.
Looking forward to tomorrow. What are some major events on the schedule, and where are we in the medal tracker?
Yeah, tomorrow, Katie Ledecky swims in that 800-meter event, as I was just saying, but that's going to be the preliminaries, and that'll be at 5 a.m. Eastern time. The finals will then be Saturday afternoon. Meanwhile, track and field basically finally starts up tomorrow, full slate of action. One of the events will be for the medal. That's the men's 10,000 meter. That'll be at 3:20 Eastern Standard Time. And there's also some men's 3-on-3 basketball. Now, this is different than the star-studded 5-on-5 that all our NBA stars are on. The U.S. will play France, though, in that at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. And as far as the medal count, the U.S. leads with 37. But as far as gold medals, China has 11. They're still number 1. The U.S. is now up to 2nd with 9 in that. So a very close race in the gold medals right now.
Well, Dave, as always, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.
Back in ancient Greece, award-winning athletes were crowned with laurel branches and believed they were chosen by gods. Medals have appeared in modern history and also do the job to celebrate victories. An exhibition at Paris Mint Museum got into the origins of these awards and the creation of the games. NTD's international correspondent David Vives went to explore.
Gold, silver and bronze, all 5,084 medals for the Olympics and Paralympic Games have been forged here at La Monnaie de Paris. This is also the place where the first medal for the Olympic Games was ever created, and it is currently getting into the Games history with an exhibition. Delving into the origin of the Olympic Games was a driving force for heritage curator Dominique Antérion to create the exhibition at La Monnaie de Paris, also known as the Mint Museum. The museum has kept centuries-old treasures that have a story to tell, such as this matrix from which were created medals in 1896 in Greece, showing Zeus, god of Olympus. Back in ancient Greece, legend has it the goddess Nike granted victory to artists, warriors and athletes with a laurel branch, in reference to the sacred olive trees of the temple of Apollo.
This is the goddess Nike, which means victory in Greek, and this goddess rewarded all kinds of victories, military victories, sporting victories, but also artistic victories. All of these fields were totally linked in ancient Greece.
The beauty of sports and physical performance were then a time of celebration.
The games were a moment of peace between the different cities, which were finally looking to the future while they were all at war. With the youth that had to be beautiful, vigorous, active, and fit. And in the end, that's what Pierre de Coubertin wanted to reinstate at the end of the 19th century.
In 1894, French historian Pierre de Coubertin began a project of international games honoring Greek traditions. He found crucial support in the US, which hosted the 1904 Games.
If it hadn't been for the United States, I think Coubertin's efforts would have been in vain. In fact, the United States believed in Olympism very early on.
Figures showcased on the medals have changed over the 20th century. The size of medals have significantly increased in the modern era. Ontario says it looks better on camera.
The Olympic gold medal must contain at least 6.5 grams of gold as required by the IOC. Most of this gold is mixed with silver in a metal called electrum. 0.5 grams are plated on the top of the medal. The silver medal is solid silver, and the bronze medal is solid bronze.
The exhibition will last until November 5th. David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
And that's all for today's news. For round-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.